Hi, I'm Marcia Lehman, and I'm a Knox County Master Gardener. Today, we're going to build a compost pile. Now, I already have bins set up. This particular bin is made of hardware cloth, which is 1/2-inch openings, which is really good when your material is in small pieces. And I would say that with all the dry weather we've had, the leaves that I have been chopping are pretty finely chopped. In fact, I ended up with powder after I was done chopping the other day, and it is about as fine as sawdust. That is not going in here. They will be pieces of leaves that you can tell are pieces of leaves and not just dust. But let me point out, what I did with this hardware cloth, I found a 10-foot roll, and if you remember your geometry, circumference is pi times the diameter. And so out of a 10-foot roll divided by pi, I get a diameter that is slightly more than 3 feet. What's important for our compost piles is we want at least a cubic yard. So if it was square, it would be 3 by 3 by 3. So getting a bin that is about 3 feet tall and about 3 feet or slightly more in diameter gives us a cubic yard. There are pros and cons to using hardware cloth. It is fine and not much stuff will fall out of the bin. The trade-off is you can easily scratch yourself on it. And the other is that I end up having, I hope you can see if we zoom in here, I have 3 zip ties that hold this bin together. So one near the bottom, one near the middle, one near the top, and I've overlapped it by about 6 inches. So I've got my 3-foot height, I've got my 3-foot diameter. You can make larger bins if you have longer material, but I probably wouldn't go much higher. I definitely am not going more than 3 feet high because I'm only 5'2". So trying to lift things up and over a higher bin is not good for me, but if you have a spouse who is 6'4", yeah, go for a bigger bin. Now, I also want to point out, we have a handout to accompany this video, and we are focusing on hot compost today. So we need a mixture of greens and browns, often called nitrogen sources and carbon sources. So we need our greens and browns, and my green is going to be coffee grounds. Even though they're brown in color, they are a source of nitrogen, so they are technically a green. In the past, I have also used pulp from a juice bar or a smoothie shop. I have gone to a microbrewery and gotten spent grains, but my favorite to use is coffee grounds. And I go to a local Starbucks who have an official Grounds for the Garden program, walk in and say, do you have any grounds for the garden? And they'll hand me a bag of coffee grounds. And I'll show you those in a moment as we start to build the pile. So we got our greens and our browns, but the other thing we need is moisture. So another thing to take into consideration is, where do you put your bins? People say, should I put them in the shade? Should I put them in the sun? A lot of that depends on where you live. It depends on the space you have. I personally like them more in the shade because as the temperature goes up, I want to trust that that heat is coming from the microbes and not the ambient temperature. But for shooting this video, you can see we're in the sun today, but we won't be in the sun all day, every day, especially as we move into the fall. And that's another point. When do you do your composting? You do it when you have your materials. So for me, fall is my composting season. And we'll give you a bit of a scan in a moment, but I have about 30 bags of already chopped up leaves. Now those 30 bags came from about 120 bags that I started with. So what I'm trying to say is collect enough material to make a cubic yard bin full at one time. A number of folks that I've bumped into who say, I can never get my compost pile hot. It's like, well, how big is it? Well, I've got a cubic yard bin. Well, how full is your bin? Well, I only have enough to fill it up a quarter of the way. Well, you don't have enough mass to get it cooking. So collect enough materials to start your bin and then accumulate more materials to make the next bin if you're going to do more than one. But today we're focused on how do we actually do this. In the handout, there are also some additional references, because your first choice is what type of bin do you want? Do you want a wire bin? And you can use the hardware cloth at 1/2-inch openings. You can use welded wire, which may have 1x1 openings. You can use 1x2 openings. I would admit I started with welded wire that was 2 inches by 4 inches, and it was okay for the first bin. But as it started to break down and the pieces got smaller, I had a lot of leakage out the sides. And in a dry year like this year, where everything is just breaking down into smaller pieces when I chop it, the 2 inch by 4 inch opening is just too big. I already have leakage on a bin that was just started and hasn't even been turned yet. So there's one of the references gives you all sorts of options, building bins from used pallets or buying a commercial tumbler. So I'd encourage you to look at those. And then we just have a really nice summary and a picture of a compost thermometer on here. So enough of me talking, let's get started. We're going to pause and I'm going to move my materials into sight so we can do this fairly quickly. I mentioned that my primary composting season is fall, and part of that, and part of the reason I use coffee grounds as my greens, is I have very little lawn. I have a lot of veggie beds and a lot of ornamental beds, so I just don't have enough grass clippings. Now, if you've got a spacious lawn and you've got grass clippings that are not treated with herbicides, then what you might do is collect leaves in the fall, chop them up, put them in the big black trash bags, and store them over the winter until next spring when you're starting to mow your lawn. And then you've got fresh green lawn clippings, which are your nitrogen source, and you've got the leaves left from the fall as your source of browns. So again, when you do your composting really depends on what materials you have, what materials you prefer to use. If you're looking, I've also added a little stick here. I normally use this for planting, but it is gradated on each side, and this side has 4-inch increments. What I'm going to try and do is put in about a 4-inch layer of chopped leaves. I will wet that because I need moisture. Then I will add some coffee grounds. Then I'll do another 4-inch layer of leaves, wet that, add more coffee grounds, and it's like making lasagna. I'm just going to do that till it's full. So if this is 36 inches high and my markings are in 4 inches, I'm going to have at least 9 layers. If you're using things like grass clippings, you're going to end up with roughly equal volume. So you could have 3 inches of chopped leaves, 3 inches of grass clippings, 3 inches of chopped leaves, 3 inches of grass clippings. But coffee grounds are so dense that there's no way I'm putting in 4 inches of leaves and then 4 inches of coffee grounds. So I'll show you how much coffee grounds I use. I have also learned that it takes me about 6 bags of the 35-gallon trash can size of chopped leaves to fill a cubic yard. So what I'm starting with are leaves I got from a neighbor that are already chopped, and then these nice paper bags. So, and I've learned from experience that about half this bag will give me the layer I want. So, it may be a little noisy, hang on, but I'm gonna pick this up and dump about half of, I've dumped about half of that in there. And at this stage, you always need a fork of some sort. When I'm turning, I prefer the pitchfork, but at this stage, just to reach in and push these around a little bit, I really like the shorter garden fork. So there's my 4 inches. Now, I come up, I grab the hose, and I have the first bin that I made with these really dry leaves. I added about 2 gallons of water per layer. So how do I know how much 2 gallons is? I got out my 2-gallon watering can and I set my nozzle on flood, and I timed how long it took to fill the 2-gallon watering can. And so for me, that's a count of between 40 and 50, depending if I'm counting slowly or quickly. So I'm going to water this for my count of 40 to 50 seconds. I won't make you watch the whole 40 or 50 seconds because that would be pretty dull. Okay, so there's my 2 gallons of water. Next to go in are some of the coffee grounds. So I mentioned going into Starbucks, and sometimes you only get a little bit and sometimes you get a lot. But I have an old Clorox bottle that I've cut as a scoop. So when I get a great big fat scoop full, I've got about a gallon of coffee grounds. And this particular bag probably doesn't have but about a gallon. And so I then sprinkle that over top so it just looks like a little layer of black pepper. Doesn't have to be a really thick layer. About a gallon will do. And then I take the bag, put the other half in, just smooth it out, get it about level. Come back. You get your steps in doing this. Get your hose. Count to 40 or 50, whatever your count is. And that may seem like a lot of water, but again, I would say normally I don't have to use that much, but what I have found with this fall being so dry, the leaves are so dry, that it needs the 2 gallons per layer. So I'm ready for another scoop of coffee grounds, and I can tell that that's about a gallon, so I'm not even going to bother putting it in the scoop this time. I'm just going to sprinkle it around. And yes, I reuse the bags. And then we're ready for another layer of leaves. So, another half bag. Level it out a little bit. Water again. Another scoop. That bag has a bit more in it. And most of these grounds came from the espresso machine. So sometimes they look like a little dark hockey puck. And you just crumble them up. That's one of the reasons I wear gloves. Other times when you go in, you may get the grounds from the big urns where they brew coffee, and then you may also get a paper filter. No problem with the filters. They will break down too. They're a brown. Okay, so another layer, the other half of the bag. Although that bag I don't think I split quite 50-50, so we'll use a little bit of that in the next layer. Back to the water. This, as I say, this is kind of like making lasagna. Okay, back to the coffee grounds. There's a full puck. And I would say when I water, I tend to put a little bit more on the outside because the outside will dry faster than the inside. So you can see what I mean about putting your bins in a place that's convenient for you, not too far from your water source. You don't really want to have to move all these bags of leaves multiple times. So If you can store them in the aisles of your garden, which is what I've done, particularly near beds that don't have anything growing anymore, you kind of kill two birds with one stone. So that was another layer of leaves, another 2 gallons of water, and another scoop of coffee grounds. Now there's a whole puck. I'll break that up. Again, because the coffee grounds are so fine, you don't need 3 or 4 inches of them. And your layers are approximate. They do not have to be precise. This is just a general guide. Back to the water. We're down to about a gallon left in this bag, so after a while you get a feel for this. So, you know, when you've got a small bag, grab another bag. And once we get this high, I don't need the fork to reach down in there anymore. That's a small bag. Yeah, but that's a good enough layer of coffee. And as you're adding water, you will notice that it does start to sink just a little bit. Not a whole lot during this first build. There we go, lots of hockey pucks in this one. As I said, Starbucks has an official corporate program called Grounds for the Garden. So you just go in, and when they say, what would you like to order? It's like, do you have any grounds for the garden? The corporate stores will do that. Sometimes the stores inside other retailers will not. So if they say no, you probably got one of the other stores. Now we're back to another layer of leaves. Another layer of water. Another layer of leaves. And probably won't get to use this full bag. Ah, coffee grounds. There we go. Thanks for the cue from the camera person. And I do like to pile it high when I first build it, because it will start to sink and compress almost immediately. So at this point I may actually tamp it down a little bit. The water will help it a little bit. And it is dusty. I'm going to finish this bag of grounds. That's about a gallon. Spread those around. And we'll finish this. Well, I don't know if we'll finish this bag. We'll be close. I'll wet this and then see if I have room just to get those last few in there. So let's see if I can squeeze that last little bit in. See if I can. See, it wants to compact already. There's still a lot of fluff and air in there. And so we wet that. I'm going to add one more scoop of coffee grounds. Break up a couple of those little pucks. And then that little bit that was left in the bag, there's room for that on top. I'll wet that down, just like all the other layers. You know, I got a piece of screen there. Okay, so one final step, and that is that generally we want to put a lid of some sort on this. It's been really dry, so it wouldn't be an issue right now, but sometimes during the winter we get heavy rains, and if this gets waterlogged, too much water, then it's going to get stinky, smelly, and go anaerobic on you, and we don't want that to happen. So my favorite material is old campaign signs, corrugated plastic, which I can fit generally with a little wiggling inside the top edge. Another reason to wear gloves. There we go. And for an extra safety measure, I usually put a paver or two on top. So there's our bin. Now in the middle of all this, I did count. We used 5 bags, and I put about a half a bag in each layer, so I've got 10 layers. So that means each of my layers is between 3.5 and 4 inches, which is what I was shooting for. And as I say, you don't really need a measuring stick. After a while, you just kind of get the feel for it. This is building a compost bin, or a compost pile. And again, what I want you to remember is collect enough material so you can fill a bin. If you start and you just get a quarter bin or a half bin, it is not going to get hot. So what I also like to do is I make a note. That's what's hanging down here. This is actually the second bin I've started, but I make a note of today's date and what the ambient temperature is. So right now it's 69 degrees outside, and that's what I'm going to start with. And then in a few days, this is going to sink a bit. I will stick a compost thermometer in it. The face of it looks exactly like in the handout. It has a steady zone between 90 and 100, an active zone between 100 and 130, and a hot zone between 130 and 160. It's got an 18-inch probe. I like to put mine in through the side, and that gets it into the middle of the pile. Other folks who use a different type of lid will come in from the top, also getting into the center of the pile. But I like to put it where it's not going to be in direct sunshine, so maybe back here, but I'll push it into the center of the pile. And initially, it will be the ambient temperature. It's 69, 70 degrees. It's going to be 69 or 70 degrees. I can tell you that on a bin that I started on November 11th, the ambient temperature was 52 degrees. 2 days later, the bin was 100 degrees, and 2 days after that, it was 140 degrees. And it has sunk 8 inches. So this is what I call hot composting, part 1, and how to build the bin. And we'll do a second video and show you how to turn the bin to keep it hot and keep it going. Because the goal for me in composting in the fall is to have as much finished compost come spring. And I want to show you what finished compost looks like. So let's take a pause here, and I'm going to grab a handful of finished compost. So, yes, I'm using my coffee ground scoop, but what is in here is not coffee grounds. It is about the last wheelbarrow load of my compost that I made last fall. It looks almost like coffee grounds. It's almost that fine. It doesn't look anything like what it started. You cannot recognize leaves. You don't recognize the coffee grounds. And from my having been in it, there is a little bit of other organic matter, leaves that floated into the bin where I store the finished compost. But yeah, it is every bit as dark and fine as those coffee grounds, just a little bit drier because I haven't been through an espresso machine. So this is what we're aiming for to have by spring. So that's why I do hot composting. Just a couple of side comments. Even if you don't have time to build a whole bunch of bins and regularly turn them to keep them hot, even if you want to do cold composting, I would still suggest that in creating the bin, you do this the first time. Because you do speed it up. You get one good cycle of heating up and the microbial activity, and then it'll cool down. But you probably cut a couple of months off of the time that it takes to finish cold compost. If you just build a cold pile with no water, no coffee grounds, it can easily take 2 years for that to finish and look like this. If you'd like to get it in about a year, then at least initially build the pile like a hot compost pile and then let it sit. And if you've got the space to do that, by all means, that's an option. So that's part 1, actually building the compost bin. If I go back through it, we want 9 or 10 layers, alternating the browns and the greens. So for me, that's the chopped leaves and the coffee grounds, plus water, because the microbes need the water. And the reason that we turn it as it starts to compress is because those microbes also need to breathe. But that comes in part 2. So this is part 1. We thank you for joining us today, and we hope you learned something. So go out, do not send those leaves to the landfill. Find a spot in your backyard, even if it's just a big pile. Don't send them to the landfill. And again, thank you for joining us.